Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Proceedings Podcast. I'm Ward Carroll. With me is my co-host, Bill Hamlet, the editor-in-chief of Proceedings Magazine. Hi, Bill.
Hey, Ward.
So obviously, Ukraine dominating the headlines. We've teed up a few things, both at Proceedings and US9 News. What would you draw the viewers' attention to with respect to Proceedings content relative to Ukraine?
Yeah, a couple weeks ago, Rear Admiral Walkendorf, Navy retired, who was the defense attaché, U.S. defense attaché in Moscow in the mid-2000s. He wrote a great piece called "Truth is the Best Way to Defeat Putin." And at that time, he was basically saying, the best way to bring an end to this thing is to get what's actually happening in Ukraine, the actions, the illegal actions by the Russian military to the Russian people. And he didn't denigrate the Russian people. He harkened back to some of the amazing things that the Russians have done over the years. Their beautiful contributions to literature, to art, to dance, to technology, to scientific exploration. They beat us to space, for example. But Putin's just the wrong guy leading that country at this time. And then, picking up on that thread, although I'm sure he didn't read Admiral Walkendorf's piece, but just echoing that same sentiment, was the great video by Arnold Schwarzenegger that came out yesterday, where Schwarzenegger harkens back to meeting a Russian powerlifter, back in the 1960s when he was a young boy, and just admiring him and saying to the Russian people, and Schwarzenegger's got a lot of fans in Russia and Ukraine, but talking to the Russian people and just saying, your government, your president is lying to you. What he's done is illegal. And this is not representative of who you are as a people. It's just a really powerful video by Arnold Schwarzenegger. I thought the messaging was just absolutely spot on. So I'll pop that in the comment too, and people can take a look at that maybe after the show. But it's just incredibly powerful messaging. In my view, perfect messaging. Because the Russian people are, and I served as a naval attaché in Russia in the mid-2000s. Admiral Walkendorf was my boss. I had wonderful interactions with individual Russians. They are proud people. They do some things incredibly well. They have this unbelievable history. But what they're doing to Ukraine right now, I think, is just not in line with their values at all. And, I think Admiral Walkendorf was spot on that, hey, you got to get the messaging to the Russian people so that they understand, what's really happening in Ukraine and who the aggressor was. And as our boss, Admiral Daly, we were chatting about this yesterday. He said he hopes that one day he wakes up and, on the front door of the Kremlin is, a big sign saying under new management, because that's really what needs to happen here. So I just thought that those two things were, just powerful messages on the right theme.
Yeah, another question that we're getting asked as we do some, media appearances in other outlets is, what is the U.S. military learning from the below average performance, to be polite about it, of the Russian military, both on the ground and in the air? And so part of the answer is an article that's currently at US9 News written by John Grady, which is Commandant Marine Corps Berger, Russian logistics failures in Ukraine should give pause to Taiwan invasion planners. So that's an interesting takeaway, which is logistics are harder than you think, Putin and Xi. And so, be careful when you step off the line of departure. And also, in the case of Taiwan, as we heard at the West Conference, we're starting to say overtly from PAC Fleet and Indo-PACOM and other places that we consider Taiwan something that we would defend in the case of a Chinese incursion. And that's something we kind of vacillated on in various ways through the years. And so that's another thing that's emerging as a function of Russia's inability to accomplish its mission goals in a short term since February 24th.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. And, it was interesting before the Russians started the invasion, there was a lot of speculation about if they do this, and I think everybody, including Putin, expected that it would go much better for the Russians, and that would send a very strong signal to China that perhaps Taiwan is an achievable goal, right? An invasion of Taiwan. But I think this right now, and as you said, Commandant Berger mentioned it, and it's in USNI News. I just plugged it into the chat window. Berger saying, "Hey, Beijing, this should give you pause because this is a lot harder, particularly against a proud country that has a determination to uphold democracy and its own ability to determine its future. And I think Taiwan has got that in spades, just like Ukraine is showing. So be careful what you wish for, Xi Jinping, which I think is really powerful. And the other thing that I think the Chinese are realizing now, just as the world has, the sanctions that are put on Russia have been much more powerful, much more crushing in terms of the impact than anybody really expected. And so I think that's another lesson that the Chinese will take from this is like, ooh, look what's happened to the value of the ruble. Look what's happened to, the ability to export from the Russian economy. I think that this is probably in the long term kind of a stabilizing effect. We'll have a stabilizing effect in Asia for all those reasons. But anyway, it's just fascinating to watch this whole thing play out. It's horrific. And, we'll just all continue to watch and pray. And also, I think the U.S. and NATO's support for the Ukrainian people has been pretty admirable so far.
Well, I think the world order, to your point, has changed in a number of ways, but not in the ways that Putin imagined it would. In fact, maybe 180 out from the ways he imagined it would. He thought he was going to create Belarus Jr. in the form of Ukraine and unite Russian peoples, but really all he's united is the rest of the world, save China. And he certainly has united NATO in ways that we couldn't have done on our own. So those unintended consequences are beneficial to the free world more than they've been to totalitarian, authoritarian dictatorships. But as you said, we'll keep our eye on this. And Commandant Berger basically saying, hey, China, don't take the wrong things away from what's happening. This isn't an opportunity for a land grab. Note how hard this is and how much the Russian military misjudged their capabilities, and so that a lot of other, and there's probably a topic for another episode talking about procurement. We probably should get our duty procurement expert to talk about how we've done it in the last 10, 20 years versus how they've done it and what Putin's priorities have been with respect to procurement and how that yields a below average military here. So, a lot of people are asking me, hey, should we be more afraid of the Russian military? I'm thinking we should not be afraid of them at all. In fact, we should redouble our confidence in how we've invested our, program of record and our capabilities to include F-35, for all of our criticism. And you and I sat down with the program manager some years ago. We're very aware of that program. But at the end of this effort, American citizens, you get a capability, and we're sort of looking like this capability is orders of magnitude superior to what the Russians have fielded in the intervening years, certainly on Putin's watch. So more to follow on this, and we'll keep the audience abreast of what is happening in proceedings in USNI News as we go forward with podcasts. But as we pointed out before, March is the Naval Review issue. We moved that from May to March this year. And as you explained during the last episode, we did that because this is 2021 in review, and we want to make sure that, we're not halfway through the year before we tee up 2021 in review. So our guest today is looking at the Marine Corps side of the house.
Yeah, our guest today is Lieutenant Colonel Wes Hammond, U.S. Marine Corps retired. Wes has written the Naval Review for many years, and he just does a terrific job. And I think this year, as we asked Wes to focus more on the analysis on what it all meant for the Marine Corps in 2021, he just did a superb job of that. His article, U.S. Marine Corps Review, is in the March issue, starts on pages 74 and 75. So Wes, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you on the show.
It's very good to be here. Thank you for having me.
All right, so Wes, just 30,000 foot perspective. Your article really was an analysis of the progress being made towards the Marine Corps' Force Design 2030. So just for the audience, what were the major muscle movements in 2021 towards the Commandant's force design?
I would say overall the biggest thing was divestitures were the key thing, making room for what he needed to be doing to redesign the force for the future. And part of it was units getting rid of, and the biggest one, of course, was the final removal of the two active tank battalions, which probably brought the biggest news. But there were other pieces to that, the bridging companies and some other assets, as well as, as you reduce some infantry units so that you could have more room to redesign and buy other things in the future. Including aircraft units, as those infantry units were reduced. Also, you had a divestiture of commitments. The special MAGTFs went away, which allowed, I think, the Marine Corps to look forward to what it was going to do, have room for more training, more time to analyze and put together where they were headed for the future. I think another piece of this was, development began in earnest of some of the key capabilities, specifically long-range strike capabilities. They did some major testing, integrating those with fleet ops as experiments. Key one, of course, is the Navy Marine Corps Expeditionary Ship Interdiction System, Nemesis, as it's called, which is a long-range strike missile. And then another key piece, and this was partly result of the accident that occurred with the AAV sinking the year before, was the strategic review of amphibious ops, sometimes we call it the Waldhauser board, for the senior member, retired General Waldhauser, that's in charge of that. You began to see some infantry battalion experiments beginning. That's really going to happen in earnest coming up this coming year. They're going to have 3 sets of different types of potential infantry battalions of the future. They're going to experiment with those and see where they're going. And then the beginnings of the maritime or the Marine Littoral Regiment, MLR, was started. A lot of discussion, but challenges, I think, were some things about funding, especially funding for things that are in R&D, where they were headed, especially rocket and missile systems. There was some concern about where the money was going to come from, though I understand early, after the new year, I think within the last couple months, there was Congress did give back $7.2 billion to the Marine Corps. But part of that concern is, where they're headed with amphibious forces. There's great utility, but also great concern about the vulnerability of the large amphibs. I think the article on the Navy side in this month's proceedings talks a little bit about that. But then what the Marine Corps also wants is a smaller, less vulnerable system, the Law of the Light amphibious warship. And so there's a lot of movement about, how many you're going to buy, what's the cost going to be, and what are going to have to be given up. And then I think, some naval integration, some issues and challenges there were major concerns. But one of the things I think was a big highlight, and it's more just the Marine Corps. It's more than just the Marine Corps, even the naval services, was a demonstration of partner interoperability. And you saw the F-18 squadron, the Marine F-18 squadron F-35 squadron that deployed with the Queen Elizabeth. And I think that was a a key landmark of the year, because it was not just showing that the capability of that aircraft, capability of the Marine Corps, but also the capability of U.S. naval forces and its ability to not only integrate, but interoperate with allies and partners, which I think is a big piece of the future.
Well, that's a lot of stuff. I want to start with, you mentioned the Marine Littoral Regiment, and so describe what that is. That's it sounds to me like a pretty significant change in the structure and the manning, training, equipping, et cetera, of the Marine Corps. What is an MLR? And you also talked about experimenting with different versions of it. So talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, and part of that, is there's the Marine Logistics or Marine the Infantry Battalion of the Future, I guess is what it's called, and that will be a component, particularly of that regiment. In some ways, the term regiment is a misnomer here, because really it's a brigade, because it's not the same types of combat arms. But beyond that, and I think this is getting into it's, what it is still in the experimental stage. So you got to be careful to say exactly what it's going to be. They're starting to look at that and do some experimentation. I know they stood up the other day, the first officially the MLR out there in Hawaii, third Marines is becoming that. But the difficult part of it is going to be, how much of it is going to be the fires base, because it really, in many ways, to support the expeditionary advanced based operations, the concept, one of the concepts that the Marine Corps is developing in order to support naval operations and maneuver for distributed maneuver operations, the naval overall concept for how we are going to potentially fight in the future. So, how much of it needs to be fires based, long range missiles, and how much needs to be infantry, scouting, and supporting the stand-in forces and what they're supposed to do. So I think it's still too early to say exactly what they're going to be. I know there's some ideas and things that people are going to start with, but I think it's really going to be in the experimentation part of it. And I think it's important that we're moving from the wargaming part of understanding what the future is to really start looking at doing experimentation, where you really, wargaming gives you some insights. But if you think that's going to give you the final answer, I think that's a mistake. You need to do experimentations, exercises that really test the capabilities.
Yeah, to that point, and a preview of coming attraction, we just put the April issue of Proceedings to bed, which is our expeditionary warfare issue. We've got an article coming that's titled Amphibious Black, which is a description of a recent exercise, Navy, Marine Corps, and Navy SEALs exercise. So there was an amphib, LPD, a DDG, Marines, and also Navy SEALs doing, essentially proving a concept of EABO, a little bit of guerrilla warfare, where the U.S. side is the practicing guerrilla warfare in an amphibious sort of context. It's a pretty great article, and it gets to your point about the experimentation, that there's going to have to be, as you said, there's been wargaming, and now there's got to be a lot of experimentation, trying things. I think trying things against a dedicated OPFOR, right? An opposition force that can show you where things are going well, but also things where some of your weaknesses of these concepts are. So pretty interesting. I'd like to move on a little bit. You also mentioned in your opening about the special MAGTFs, right? And so if somebody read the Marine Corps in Review over the past few years, you've had a lot of information about, this special MAGTF in CENTCOM and in Africa and different places. And those are going away, or they've already gone away.
They've all gone away. Yes.
So that's a pretty, each one of those is what, 1,500 Marines?
Usually, yeah, about that. It depended on the size, especially Southcom could be different. Southcom wasn't a permanent one, the one that supported Southcom, but both the AFRICOM and the CENTCOM ones were permanent rotating forces, usually forces in between amphibs. And I think this gets back to, restarting the amphib rotation a little bit more is going to be what you'll see more replacement of that. But it also gives you some bandwidth to start doing more experimentation, exercises, training, looking at the future too. So I think that's a piece of this.
So if you bring those forces home, and they're not, you're not constantly trying to rotate additional Marines out to these special MAGTFs, it gives you more forces with which you can experiment, with which you can, try those 3 different variants of the infantry battalion of the future. Am I getting that right?
That's part of it, I think, but also, it just, part of it also is you're reducing the size of the force. So being able to just sustain that and do this transformation just became an impossible, requirement. So that's a piece of it.
So, Colonel, one of our regular viewers, Toro Porco, ask a question that I was going to ask you here. It just seems prima facie that when you say we're taking the tanks away, that would have been a big deal, certainly for tankers. How does the divestiture of tanks impact the ability of the Marine Corps to execute combined arms doctrine? And what about the notion of direct fire support?
I think there's a lot of questions there. I mean, had an interesting conversation with a friend of mine the other day, and let me just start by saying that, I fully understand and am committed to what the Commandant's doing, and the fact that something needed to change and we need to look at the future. I'm not sure I would have divested everything at this point before we finished all the experimentation and exercises, but he's got a lot more insights. But one of the comments one of my friends made the other day was the fact that, what we're seeing in, in Ukraine with the Russian tank columns getting just decimated, at least that's what we're seeing on YouTube and videos of what's happening, is just reinforces, the Commandant's decision. And I said, well, wait a second. If that was true, why wouldn't we come to the same conclusion of, the 1939-1940 Finnish-Russia war, where, columns of Russian tank divisions were just decimated by small columns of Finnish ski soldiers that just, stopped them for months and created a real problem for the Russians. Yet, we saw some of the largest tank battles in the world following that were, very decisive and many people would show proved it. The same thing with the 73 war, when, in the Yom Kippur War, when the Israeli tank forces were decimated in the beginning by Saggers, and then they were able to learn their lessons very quickly, which is, this piece of adaptability, which is something else that I think is important here that we need to think about. But this adaptability, they were able to describe and use tanks then for the rest of that 3-week war that was very decisive. And then, following that, our tanks were important for the ground war in the, in the Gulf War. Now, I would say that, how we use tanks. I mean, there's obviously some technical issues going on. There's technology changing. There was a requirement for greater armor or some kind of defensive capabilities that was becoming expensive. Maintaining it, maintaining the systems, and how the Marine Corps trained and provided that expertise was becoming questionable. And so those issues, I think, were all wrapped up in it. But I am concerned. I mean, I can tell you, my father was an infantry battalion commanding officer in Vietnam, and his life was probably saved up around Con Tien by a small tank platoon that he had with his battalion when they were almost overrun by 2 North Vietnamese regiments. So I do have a strong personal feeling to what tanks can provide you. As when we landed in Somalia, I was with a MEU there. I was the battery commander for the artillery battery there, and we were a very small MEU, and we didn't have tanks with us, but we did have an MPF ship that was attached because we were such a small MEU, and we offloaded the tanks and used them for a short period. Most people say, "Hey, we didn't have any armor in Somalia." Well, in the first month we did, and we used the tanks. And as I commented to people, because when we left, somebody said, "Oh, we don't need tanks because we never use them." And my comment was, nobody ever needs a tank until they need a tank.
That's a great point. I want to step back for a second, because all of this is sort of headed towards a concept that's been in our pages and in many other places over the last 2 years or so: Expeditionary Advanced Base Operations, which is a Marine Corps concept that is geared towards really a fight in the Western Pacific, in and among islands in the South China Sea, around Taiwan, if you will. It's geared towards small mobile detachments of Marines that can go ashore, as you mentioned, the Nemesis system, which includes the Naval Strike Missile in a format with a launcher that you take it off of a ship and you can put it ashore and you can move it around and you can use targeting data, and the Marines can actually reach out with an anti-ship killer missile. There's a lot of debate in our pages about, is that doable? Is it logistically supportable? Is it, are those units likely to go ashore in places where they're going to be stealthy enough that the Chinese can't find them? How do you reduce the signature? So there's an ongoing debate, and it's coming, in upcoming issues of the magazine, including the April issue. So what are you hearing about EABO and about the ability for the Marine Corps to operate in such small units in a stealthy manner, but also in a way that is small enough, but also powerful enough to have an impact on the potential adversary, China, in this case?
I actually worked with Art Corbett, who passed away a year or so ago, and was kind of the chief writer of that. And Art and I used to have a lot of conversations sitting down talking about EABO. I brought some historic perspective to that. I think, if you look at the idea of how advanced base operations have evolved from Guantanamo Bay in 1898, which I think is a landmark thing that probably deserves more study, and then how it advanced as technology and capabilities changed over the years. This is just a continuation of that. So I don't think it's that revolutionary in many ways. It provides capabilities, using littoral terrain to support the fleet for both sea control and power projection is always fundamental to a full maritime operation. So I think it's a piece of that. But I think there's a couple things. I think part of it gets into how, and this goes back to the direct fire as well as indirect fires. I mean, which is another concern. Indirect fires for support of the forces ashore is a concern of mine, and I think many others, and finding that balance. It's also the concern of how much forces do you need to support and provide that security of those forces ashore, as well as ensure their mobility between islands. And I would say it's not just the first island chain. It gets back into the breadth of it, deeper into the second island chain, and perhaps even behind that to a degree that we need to be very much focused on and concerned about, and provide that depth to the operating area. I would also say that so I think, I'm concerned that giving up as much indirect fire support to provide a capability to halt is something that needs to really be experimented very closely and understanding. Part of the testing that's been going on is this idea of the organic precision fires, which is essentially like kamikaze UAVs that we saw in the Azerbaijan Armenia fight, that people took a lot of lessons from, which I always think you need to be very careful. Like I said about, what we're seeing in the tank battalions or the tank units columns in Ukraine, be careful, looking back and studying things, you come up with some different conclusions once you analyze what the real reasons are. And I think the same thing when we look at, how effective can you give the mass you need? Can you give the time on targets, the precision fires? Can those be achieved with this organic precision fires? And that's a question mark. Well, now, I think with the survivability of the tanks, of those forces, EABO, mobility is going to be the key part of this. And so lightening up is important, but I would say that having some mobile armor is also going to be. And there's a whole number of ways I think you can look at how you reduce your vulnerabilities, not just lightness and mobility. And you have to really have a combination of those. The other piece of this whole thing is there's two other pieces, I think. The putting together the communications and the networks so that it's not just, that fire system and sensor system is fully integrated with the whole naval force. That's going to be difficult, and that's going to be a challenge, but I think it's solvable. The other piece is logistics. And, I've written quite a bit about logistics. I think if you recall, back in 2017, I submitted that essay for the CNO's essay contest talking about mobile logistics in a sea control naval maneuver warfare type operation, and showing what, if we look at the Second World War and naval operations in the Pacific, we look at these, very effective carrier battle groups, very effective amphibious forces, very effective submarine forces. But if you look at that mobile logistics, and there's really three pieces of it. There was things ashore that Seabees put in. There was the tenders and repair ships and floating dry docks that followed the fleet in protected areas. And then by the end of the war, you had a really advanced combat logistics force or underway replenishment capability that would follow and resupply from those advanced bases that were populated with the tenders and supply ships and other things, as well as then stay close to the battle forces. That capability, I think, is important, and then I think that's what you talk about logistics and what the commandant said the other day about how much the Chinese are learning. Now, the Chinese learned very quickly. If we look back at the Renaissance and what the Chinese PLA has done since the Gulf War, they really took those lessons and changed a lot of their force to address those. I think Mick Ryan's book that just came out the other day, that was just published by the Naval Institute, really talks about how they're looking at the future, but it's based on their understanding of not only their culture of how they fight, but also looking at how we fight. So yes, I think it will give pause to them, but they're going to advance. Don't be surprised if they figure this out fairly quickly. For us, I think logistics needs to really focus on a number of ways. Understand that you're going to take casualties, but I think it's a solvable problem with pre-positioning, unmanned systems, a whole number of capabilities that you can ensure that you have available.
Well, so to go back to your point about UAVs, particularly you're talking about the Switchblade UAVs that are, sort of the flavor of the month right now. You make a good point about acquisition priorities and everybody being all in. We saw this during the post 9/11 wars with MRAPs. I think in hindsight, although Secretary Gates championed this as a proof that with the right focus and lawmakers' support, you can rapidly field a capability. But when I went to Afghanistan and I was embedded with the 101st Airborne, they were like, we have too many of these things, and then you can see how much we left there when we pulled out, so if we flood the zone with, again, Bill and I were talking about current events and actually comment on Berger's point that he is saying, hey, China should take pause if they're thinking about taking Ukraine because of logistics. And, what are the takeaways that we're learning from the Russian lack of an advance here? As you've said, logistics is a big one, right? So we want to make sure, to your point, that we're learning the right lessons and that everybody doesn't start hyperventilating. And this is what you hear from the chattering class. And this is why every once in a while, we should probably just turn the TV off and stop looking at Twitter, because everybody's all in on, they need MiG-29s and now they need Switchblade, UAVs and Patriot missiles and, all this sort of things. It could be true for the tactical situation that is 24 hours. But in terms of our focus and our procurement priorities, we need to make sure we're looking both tactically and strategic, which is kind of your point.
Yeah, and I've had this discussion with a Australian colonel that I've had a little discussion with, and one of the points he makes, and I agree with him, is the idea that a good logistics system is a huge deterrent, because it really tells somebody that even if you have all these other capabilities, you've got the staying power that he's got to be very concerned about. And so we need to think about that too. And that's, there's an article in this month's history magazine, Naval History Magazine, by Peter Hoare, that talks about the Falklands and the logistics capability from the Ascension Island that he was in charge of. And I've got some questions out to him about, how, one of the questions is, what were they going to do after mid-June? Admiral Woodward makes the comment that, by mid-June, he was going to have to pull the fleet back because they were just going to be torn apart. Well, how do we create that sustainability of naval maneuver fighting, because, you know, really for 70 years, we haven't done naval maneuver fighting. We've done what Bob Work calls, you know, naval movement, where we've had the capacity of having naval supremacy that allows us to move forces across, you know, transatlantic or transoceanic areas in order to, you know, project power on the Eurasian mainland. Now we're talking about having to fight for that sea control first. And you know, when you have a force that's been optimized for generations, not to have to worry about those problems, and logistics is probably the biggest one. It creates some cultural issues, because you're not talking about assumptions anymore. They've become so deeply embedded, they're presumptions you don't even realize you think about.
That's a great point. You know, we've talked a lot about the optimized fleet response plan, right, which really became a leaned out business plan for projecting, you know, naval power into CENTCOM. I mean, you know, it was, we're going to schedule the ship's maintenance. We schedule the deployments. This is when they deploy. This is exactly how many logistics ships you need to keep 1 or 2 carriers deployed to CENTCOM. I mean, that was a very, it was a business plan, if you will, for keeping a certain amount of naval power forward deployed in CENTCOM to project power into Iraq and Afghanistan for 20 odd years. But now, to your point, you're going to have to fight for sea control. You're going to have to fight to project that force, but also then to protect the logistics trail that will support it, right? And that is,
and you have to have that logistics trail built. I mean, or at least have the capacity to build it quickly. And the other piece, I mean, you talk about, you know, optimizing a force for a rotational naval, you know, presence capability is much different than DMO, where you essentially are going to have to, you know, be able to fairly quickly project 80-90% of the fleet forward. And that creates all kinds of problems.
And they're not going to be concentrated as a carrier strike group, right? So with a carrier strike group and an oiler, you can have all of your ships within 50 or 100 miles of each other. So when it's time to gas them up, they come in. But in distributed maritime operations, they, you know, what is currently a carrier strike group in terms of assets, they might be dispersed hundreds of miles. And so the logistics plan, just to keep them all fueled up, becomes much more difficult, right? And to keep them dispersed so that they're not a concentrated target, that's a difficult challenge. I want to get on.
Well, before we leave that point, just in terms of the counterpoint to, because I don't think anybody beats us up as well as we beat up ourselves with respect to these things. So as we look at Brand X, whether it's Russia or China, again, what's emerging is we are, meaning the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, have always been an expeditionary force. We can do over the horizon. I'm not so sure in the years since the fall of the wall that the Russians have attended to their capability of being an over-the-horizon Navy. And I think particularly, I was on deployment as a department head in 1995 aboard the USS America, and the Kuznetsov deployed for the first time ever. And they came into the Med and immediately broke down off the coast of Tunisia. And if you look at the history of that ship of the line, it has never really done anything of consequence for all of the fanfare and everything else. So as you look at the state of their military currently as demonstrated in Ukraine, and certainly the associated naval assets, like the amphibs that are hanging off of Odessa, still have not come ashore. There's some question, as you talk to Sam Legron and others who know a thing or two about their order of battle, as to how lethal these are, how ready these are. And same with China. China does not have a constant forward presence. They're concerned about their hemisphere, their, you know, the island chains, the first island chain, the second island chain. We've talked about this for, you know, at length on the podcast, and Bill has teed this up in the pages of proceedings, you know, for years. So I know we have work to do, but I think relative to the opposition, we're kind of in a good place with how we operate now. And yes, copy that distributed lethality increases the aperture of what you've got to support. But I think what we're learning here, and this is to comment on Berger's point, is that maybe we're more ready than we thought. Now, it doesn't mean slash the defense budget or stop doing bilateral exercises or et cetera, et cetera. But I think some of the lessons that we're learning here out of this war is NATO isn't as hosed up as we thought. and certainly our procurement priorities maybe have been okay and on target. And the way we do training and reporting and everything else is, the military is being accused of being woke and all these other things. I think we're kind of, by and large, ready for the threat.
If I make one more point, I just want to, I would agree with you on a lot of that. We can beat ourselves up a lot, but one issue I do probably want to touch on a little bit is this idea of naval integration and what it means, because it's both logistics, it's both this command and control, and the webbing together of weapons, sensors, and communications. And that's probably, I do have some concern about that. And it was interesting. When this first came out, when the idea of EABO and Force Design 2030, the Commandant's design priorities came out, and obviously naval integration was a big piece of this. I said to a friend of mine, how are we going to do this? And he's works over in the Pentagon in policy, but we were together in the Strategic Initiatives Group at Headquarters Marine Corps years ago. And he said, Wes, it's just like, your thesis on, counter battery from the sea. So let me explain that a little bit. So years ago, when I was at Monterey, I was in the electronic warfare systems engineering curriculum, and I did my thesis on how to modify the Spy-1 radar to do the same thing as our counter battery radars. They're both phased array radars. And part of that came from that landing in Somalia, where we were asked, what do we need before we landed? And I said, hey, this is a lot like Beirut. As the battery commander, I'd like to have the radar, the counter battery radar, the Q-36 that we have brought. Well, we don't bring it on float, but so they were going to send it out. So it took 3 weeks before it finally arrived. And the whole time I'm looking out at the ships at sea, and I go, why can't I use that ship's radar? Because it's, a phased array. Long story short, I did my thesis. It was fairly easy. So I did that in 96, 99. The Navy tested it. And the test off of Camp Lejeune, live fire test with the USS Higgins, went extremely well. They had I think they tracked all but one round, and even they were firing both ashore. They were firing both 155 artillery and 81 mortars, and they got a CEP, a circular air probability, for where the firing positions were, of less than 16 meters, I think was what they came out to. So very small, very accurate, and could have been used. So back to where my friend was, a few years ago, and he says, well, it's just like your thesis, this thing. I said, yeah, but since 1999, the Navy hasn't spent $1 on that. And even though they said at the time it was only going to be about a $2 million upgrade to the radar, because it's only software that had to change, we haven't done anything. And that's even after that, you had a requirement that came in from Naval Forces Korea that said, hey, this is a capability we really need. But still, so I guess there is some concern I have about where we're headed with naval integration and how we're going to put this all together. If we haven't even done some easy things that we could have done, that would have been just even force protection, much less, strike and more, things that we're more concerned about now, if we still haven't done those.
No, that's a great point. A great story. And sorry to hear that the Navy hasn't upgraded Aegis to be able to do that capability. It sounds like a kind of a no-brainer. To the point about, this is another follow-on with naval integration. There's a lot of talk about the light amphibious warship, and you mentioned it in your opening remarks. And the design process is, I think, has begun, but what it's going to look like and how many we're going to build and how many we can afford. And I'm curious, is that envisioned as something that the Marine Corps owns, or is it a Navy capability like the LCACs are that we that's a ship-to-shore connector that the Navy owns that moves Marines?
I think it's going to still stay as a Navy asset for a lot of reasons. I think just, as I mentioned, part of the arguments for, divesting of the tanks was keeping that, having the right level of expertise. I think even more for a ship like this is even more apparent than even tanks were. So just for that reason, I think, even with the problems we have with AAVs and ACVs, You know, I don't see the Marine Corps going to taking charge of a larger ship. I would probably say that I would see, you know, that these part of the and there's some discussion about this, how the larger amphibs are going to be used may not just be as dedicated towards the Marine Corps as they have been in the past. I mean, they bring a lot of capabilities, like medical capabilities are going to be important, that are mobile, but also the use of them for the unmanned systems across the fleet, not just the Marine Corps, is probably something that will be more and more experimented with.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And, you know, a lot of people have said, well, you know, aircraft carriers, you know, the Chinese have got this carrier killer missile. Now they've got two of them, the DF-21D and also the DF-26, which can reach even farther out to sea. And so maybe we just need these light, you know, the light carriers, the Lightning carriers, which are smaller, more America class type ships. But I can tell you from an intelligence perspective of finding a ship at sea and targeting it, there's very little difference between finding a Ford class carrier at sea, which is, you know, a little over 1,000 feet long, and finding a ship that's 800 feet long. Both have big flat decks. If the Chinese can find one, they can probably find the other. So those big amphibs, to your point, will probably need to be perhaps further back, but projecting fires or projecting ISR capability further forward, you know, than they currently, you know, probably do in practice. What are you hearing on the back to the light amphibious warship? What are you hearing about the timeline for, you know, getting the design requirements and then actually contracting, and when will we start to, you know, bend steel for those things?
I think they're looking. Gosh, I don't have it in front of me.
It's still a few years away, though.
Yeah, it is. And just like anything, I mean, you know, Ward talked a little bit about the acquisition process, and I have a little bit of experience with it. You know, you can do things quickly, but, you know, lots of times when you do that, you got to accept the mistakes and the waste that you're going to is inherent in that. And sometimes people are willing to do that. I think, as you point out, early on in OIF-1 or OIF-2, you know, after we became engaged in Iraq, Congress was more than willing to accept a lot of waste. Now, questions came later about, you know, why'd we do this? Why'd we do that? But part of it was because, you know, there was a process and people accepted at the time and didn't ask a lot of questions. So, you know, we could see a lot of things change if this war becomes larger in Europe, and a lot of people's mindsets change about how we're going to move forward. I always look back at, you know, in World War II, you know, before World War II, the U.S. Navy, naval forces, you know, we were slowly increasing. But if you look at like the week after France falls and Congress goes back into session, and like a week or two later, you increase the Navy by 70% in a vote. So, you know, the war had already begun a year before that, or less than about 9 months before that. And then in mid-July, suddenly, you know, they realize this is really important and big. And so we could see it. It depends how long things go, what happens, how much destruction occurs, how other, you know, how China reacts to it in the end. So there's some things I could see happen here.
Great points. Wes, we're running close on time here. Just one more question for you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, project out a year from now, the March 2023 issue that reviews 2022 for the Marine Corps. What do you think? What do you think the big things will be? Will there be just a continuation of what you've described in this year's issue, or are there some certain, you know, perspectives or you know, big movements that you expect to see in the Marine Corps for the remainder of 2022?
Well, I think I left it at the end of 2021 with the issue of money, and which kind of gets back to what I just talked about. You know, what happens, you know, in the current conflict that's going on in Europe. I think that could have a big, you know, impact on this, especially if we see more saber rattling in the Pacific too. Somebody taking advantage of that, and I think, you know, our allies, you know, showing a lot more dedication to what their responsibilities are probably will help drive us to do more. So I think that could be a piece of it. So we'll wait and see. I think the F-35 decision from the commandant, where he stands on where those squadrons are, is probably a big piece that will come out. I also think, what happens during these initial tests of the infantry battalions, and some ideas of where this Marine littoral regiment's going. All those pieces, I think, are probably, those are somewhat continuations, and I anticipate those. Some other things. I think there's also going to be some look now at, part of the EAB shedding and the requirements of it. I think there's some questioning going on about how to ensure that we are able to achieve access when it's really going to be challenged. And so I think there's going to be some really discussions and looking at that. I'm really waiting to see, since it still hasn't come out, that amphibious study, the Waldhauser board. I'd really like to see what its results are.
Well, those are great previews. Thank you again for being on the show. Our guest has been Lieutenant Colonel Wes Hammond, U.S. Marine Corps retired. He's the perennial author of our Marine Corps in Review, and in the March issue of Proceedings this year, starts on page 74, 75. A really great recap of what 2021 meant for the Marine Corps. Wes, thanks again.
You're welcome. Thanks, you.
Okay, that wraps up another episode of the Proceedings podcast. Our next episode will be on Monday with an active duty Marine, Major Schwartz, who's got an article coming up in the April issue of the magazine titled "Marines Need Light Infantry, Not Less," which is just a great, another great article. Very, very much to the point of what we've been talking about today. So we'll see you on Monday next week. Until then, remember, victory begins at the Naval Institute.
And we'll remind you that this and every podcast is brought to you by the members of the Naval Institute. For more about membership, go to usni.org/join.